G'day City Skylines fans, we're back with another feature highlight, number 5 on the list, which is city services. Electricity, water, sewage, health and death care, education and safety. We also get a closer look at how service buildings can be upgraded, which is really neat, with 3 different types of upgrades. So I'm excited to look into that in more detail, as well as how we can apply services to specific districts now, or even import and export certain services, which is something I'm quite excited for personally. So let's take a look at some of this in more detail. Like previous weeks, the video is quite good and gives you a good overview, but the actual Dev Diary blog post on Paradox Interactive's website is far more detailed, has so much more information, so I'll drop a link to that below so you can check it out. One of the first things that's obvious though as you read through this is there's a real push and drive focusing on the needs of citizens. Are they happy? Are they not happy? And what can we do to influence that? And then in turn how that increases their willingness to pay higher rent and thus driving up the land value. We've got the previous Dev Diary zones and signature buildings, which I'll drop a link in the corner to, and that goes into land value in more detail, so we won't cover that today. But it's just interesting that this time around with this game, it's not just a matter of evenly distributing education, police and fire, for example, throughout the city. It's much more complex than that, which is what we're seeing from some of the previous Dev Diaries in terms of a lot of the AI and a lot of the other functionality that's available in the game. They outline the different service types, and some of which are brand new, which is quite exciting to kind of delve in and see what they're like. Roads are the first ones, and we've already had the Dev Diary on Road Tools, Dev Diary number 1, so we won't go into that in any more detail this time around. Then we have electricity, water and sewage, healthcare and death care, garbage management, education and research, fire and rescue, police and administration, transportation, again which we'll not touch on, that's Dev Diary number 3, parks and recreation, and then communications, which encompasses postal services, which is something we've got in the current game, but again they're taking it to another level in this new version, and telecommunications, which is the internet, and we'll come on to that in a second. Nothing too groundbreaking under electricity, a lot of different power plants and power sources that we're used to seeing in terms of wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, as well as fossil fuels, coal, gas, nuclear, if you want to go down that route. I think one of the key things this time around, and they've touched on it in a previous Dev Diary as well, is when we look at something like fossil fuels, we have to take into consideration the direction of the wind, so that if you're putting a coal power plant, for example, on the edge of your city, you need to make sure that the pollution isn't blowing across your city and making everybody sick, because there's ramifications for that. Water and sewage is both familiar, and there's some new elements, which is also quite cool. So obviously if you don't have fresh water, it leads to people becoming unhappy and companies having their efficiency decrease. But one of the key changes we're seeing here is now on maps we have groundwater, which works quite differently to what we're used to in City Skylines. So you can no longer put a water pump anywhere with a water source. We need to tap into these groundwater sources around the map, and these reservoirs, as they call them, have a limited refreshment rate. So that's something to take into consideration. Obviously, again, we don't want to put industry near them and pollute the ground, compromising the water supplies, but it looks like with our sewage treatment plants, we can clean that sewage, pump fresh water back into our city's water network, and then the solid waste that's a byproduct of that, we then need to haul to our garbage management sites. So quite a bit different to what we're used to, but something that I think is more realistic this time around. Nothing too dissimilar to what we're seeing in terms of healthcare and death care. Obviously the fundamental change is that ambulance respond to traffic accidents, which is obviously new functionality, and it'll be quite exciting to see how that kind of works. Obviously if we create traffic jams as well, then service vehicles, not just ambulances, fire engines and police cars get stuck. So we need to consider these things as well. But yeah, glancing through this information, there's nothing too dissimilar that we're not used to just now. They do tie this back to citizens again, making sure their health is fine and how that's affected in terms of the availability of healthcare, pollution, previous illnesses and injuries, and also uncollected garbage can obviously make them sick as well. Same deal with garbage management, again not too dissimilar to what we're used to working with in the current game. I think one of the key things, watching the video, you see now that like farms in the previous video, our landfills, we can actually set them out in a custom way and define the area using the tools at our disposal now, which I think is really neat. Rather than plopping a predefined size of landfill or having to plop multiple landfill buildings, we can now create a bigger and bigger expanse. So that's something that's a little bit different, but in terms of incineration plants, we just need to watch with the air pollution, as I said previously. With the recycling center, it's really good to see that the usable parts from that garbage turns into resources that can then be used by manufacturing companies. So there's almost like a supply chain at work there, which I think is really neat. Education and research is quite interesting. The fact that they're talking about citizens actually making a choice and calculating which is more beneficial to them, starting work now in a lower position and earning money, or studying for higher education, which would then possibly provide them with a position earning more money. That kind of blows my mind a little bit, because like in previous dev diaries, we're just seeing this extra level of complexity, and it looks like education hasn't escaped that complexity, which I think is a good thing. One of the other differences I've spotted is, unlike now where we get the not enough worker warning and then eventually buildings go abandoned, this time around it's actually hampering production output and affecting that negatively. So efficiency decreasing, potentially profit decreasing, things like that. So again, just seeing it all kind of tied in together. Some old favourites returning under fire and rescue, fire watch towers, the firefighting helicopter depot. I'm quite happy to see these make a return. I quite like watching little helicopters spread out and fight fires across your city, which is quite cool. And then similar to what we managed with just now, if we create areas of traffic jams, then these service vehicles can't get through. And by the looks of this dev diary, it says fires spread quickly. So I don't know if we're going to see them spread faster than we're used to seeing them spread right now. It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Police and administration, so I'm excited for this when we have this concept that I've said in one of the previous dev diaries about this outside connections and how it plays more of a role in how our city is managed, not just in terms of importing and exporting services, which I use a mod for in the current game, and which other simulation games in this genre have done in the past. I'm really excited to see that come to City Skylines 2. I'm quite excited to see that before we make a prison available in our city, that prisoners will be transported to an outside connection to serve their prison sentence if a local prison isn't available, and after serving their time, their criminal status is reset and they return to the city. These types of things, although probably boring for other people, I just think it adds that level of realism, and it's something that I'm really excited to see. One other change to this category is under administration. So we now have the welfare office, which helps people down on their luck and boosts their well-being if their happiness is below half. So again, we see this tie back to our Sims and how happy they are, how healthy they are, and it's our responsibility to do something about that. And then obviously this administration building, the welfare office, is one of those buildings where they can travel to and have that kind of happiness rejuvenated in a way, if you want to kind of look at it like that. We also have a city hall helping to lower loan interest rates and import costs, which will also help us in terms of managing the budget, and then the central bank as well, reducing loan costs, boosting company profits. I like this as a kind of added element of realism to the game. Transportation I won't touch on, we had that in Dev Diary 3, so I'll put a link in the corner for that one. In terms of parks and recreation though, this is again slightly different to what we're used to now. Obviously at the moment we can plop parks around our city to increase land value. This time around it's really different. We can put parks, plazas and tourist attractions and landmarks around the city, but it's more about answering our citizens' various needs, and if they're met, citizens find the area where they live more appealing and increase that land value as a result. So constantly driving back to how our citizens are feeling and their various needs and making sure we cater to those rather than just plopping these service buildings around and job done. communications. So this covers postal services and telecommunications. I think what's nice to see this time around is actually we're doing something a little more in depth with postal services. Obviously we can have that functionality at the moment. We can put post offices and sorting facilities around, but this time it looks like it directly impacts our citizens' happiness. If they're able to send letters and postcards, that makes them happier. If they're unable to do that, then less so. So again, seeing that influence we can have via these different services, which is quite cool. Telecommunications I'm quite excited about. So I always think in modern society at the moment, we obviously have services like electricity and water and things like that. But really in this modern age, the internet or an internet connection is really up there with an essential service for, you and I. So it's nice to see that replayed in the game, adding that level of realism. So citizens and companies are going to want a high-speed internet connection. We can service that by putting telecommunication towers around our city and having the option to upgrade the network bandwidth with each telecom tower that we put to ensure that it's at a speed and of coverage that is beneficial to the citizens. Landscaping and pathways, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Check it out on the blog site. I'm glad to see that functionality is returned. Quite interesting to see that we have a vegetation tool now, so when we plant trees, they eventually grow into mature trees. So there's a whole life cycle element added there, and obviously forest fires destroy them, so they need to regenerate and regrow over a period of time. Now, service upgrades is something I am excited about. We have seen that in other famous games within this genre, of which I won't name just now, but you know what I mean. So I'm really looking forward to this element coming to City Skylines 2, the fact that we can upgrade service buildings. And not only that, there's 3 upgrade types. There's operational upgrades, which seems to be about kind of smaller upgrades, bandwidth increases for radio masts, exhaust filters for coal power plants, things like that. Then we have extension upgrades, and these are more visible upgrades connected directly to the building, and things like increasing a building's vehicle capacity, its output, its range, or the number of citizens being serviced. So if we put down a fire station or a police station and it's only servicing a suburb, but then in the future we decide to turn that suburb into high density residential, having the ability to then upgrade that service building to service more citizens as that suburb grows in population is really, really neat, and something that makes sense. You should be able to do that. Sub-buildings is the 3rd level of upgrades, and that's where separate buildings are attached to the service building's existing lot. So that's where we see, for example, fuel storage capacity of, say, a power plant being increased. The difference with sub-buildings to extensions is that the footprint of the building expands, so we need to keep that in mind. If we don't have room, or if it's in a really built-up area, we're going to need to make room for it as it expands. They touch on service coverage in a bit more detail, so it's nice to again see how this mechanic is going to work. They talk about the 2 main elements to that being passive coverage effect and simulated effect, and use the example of a police station where its very presence decreases the accumulation of crime in that neighborhood, but you see that simulated effect in terms of police cars out there patrolling the wider city. There's a lot of detail on the blog around service coverage, so I'll let you go through that in your own time. But again, it's great to get that insight into how these mechanics work. Service efficiency is something that they also go into a lot more detail about on the blog, which is great. It's good to see how that mechanic works as well, and they list out functions that are affected by that efficiency, things like fire and rescue, the number of fire engines, the number of police cars, for example, or road maintenance vehicles. They also go into how they calculate that efficiency and how employees play an important factor when it comes to building efficiencies. So are employees happy? Are they healthy? Do they have the right education levels? And again, doing that full circle piece around putting the onus back onto us to make sure we influence that in the right way. They talk a little bit in service efficiency about the city budgets, but then we come into service fees, which is also that added next level or next layer of detail, which I quite like. The fact that we can charge for electricity and water, which again adds that level of realism. We do that in real life, so now we're seeing that brought to the game. So they're really going in hard about this kind of realism element, which I'm really excited to see, and giving us the ability not just to set the budget, but to have that work in tandem with charging fees for that, so we can try and recoup money and spend that on other city services. And to see that also applies not just to electricity and water, but healthcare, garbage, roadside parking fees. It just gives us a lot more control, where we can maybe beg, borrow and steal from one city service and apply that to another when we're trying to balance the books. Service trade is something else I'm really excited about. So seeing that we have the option with electricity, water and sewage to import and export those services outside of our city. So we may decide when we're just starting off that we want to build one particular type of service and really invest in that, export an overabundance, and then use the money generated from that to maybe buy in another service. So still balancing the books, but just having all of these options at our fingertips makes for a much more exciting game. They also talk about the fact that if you don't have medical facilities or education or police and fire, they can also be imported, but obviously response times for, say, police and fire are really slow as they're coming from outside connections. And obviously with education and things like that, if citizens start getting annoyed they have to travel outside of your city to get a certain type of education, will they move out altogether? It's also nice to see a return of districts and policies, and not just policies at a district level, at a citywide level. So we have those two, and they're quite different and their influence is quite different. It's neat to see we have a new district tool as well, so similar to that kind of way in which a farming area was built out, and also the landfill which we saw in the video as well. With districts, it looks like a similar thing. We can create those. We seem to have kind of waypoints where we can maneuver them a little bit more easily than just painting them with a brush. So again, some nice added features there and some nice sort of tweaks to what we're currently seeing. They give us a hint at some of the policies. So for example, with city policies, there's the option to remove speed limits from highways, or installing air filters for manufacturing companies in industrial zones to limit the air pollution. So it'll be exciting to see what other options we have at our disposal. They tell us we have 7 different districts policies and 5 different city policies available to us. I don't know whether that'll change longer term as maybe more DLCs and things come out. They'll maybe add more different options for us. So I'm going to leave it there. That's feature highlight number 5, all about city services. Let me know in the comments below what you're excited to see or what your thoughts about this are. I think for me, some of the key takeaways, or some of the probably the top 3 things I'm most excited about from this, are upgradable service buildings, importing and exporting services, and having that ability to charge service fees for like electricity or water, or just being able to charge a fee for providing that service, which will then allow me to balance the books of my city from there. So yeah, some really cool stuff. As I said, check out the blog. I've put a link below, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks again for watching.